Hi, I'm Bob Thur, and on behalf of the Vilna Board, welcome and thank you for joining this virtual Vilna program. I want to especially thank our partner organizations for this program, HIAS, Congregation Beth Elohim, Congregation Kehillat Israel, WBUR, and the Boston Public Library. Built in 1919, our historic building on Beacon Hill is the only remaining Jewish historic landmark in downtown Boston and has recently undergone a $4 million renovation that will enable the Vilna to serve our community in exciting, expanded ways once we are able to gather together again. In the meantime, we've had over 5,000 people join our virtual Vilna Zoom programs. Tonight's topic, immigration, is particularly meaningful to the Vilna since the shul was built by immigrants from Lithuania during the Spanish flu pandemic. We can certainly imagine their worries, fears, economic and health crises from 100 years ago for that generation of immigrants, many of whom did not yet speak English. As one of our community members often says, he hears the voices of our Jewish past every time he is in the building. Yes, the Vilna congregation, which began in 1893, was a shul, a spiritual place of worship, but it was also a center for Jewish life and tangible support to those Jewish immigrants of Boston. Now, over 100 years later, think of us as a JCC or 92nd Street Y on Beacon Hill, a central hub of activity, all the while brimming with history. For tonight's program, Mark and Shannon will make opening remarks, followed by conversation with each other. We will then jump to audience Q&A, so if you have a question at any point during the conversation, please type it into the Q&A box. Now, I'm happy to introduce Kristin Mate from the Boston Public Library to welcome our speakers.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm glad to be here on behalf of the Boston Public Library for this important program. I'm an adult programs librarian at the Central Library nearby Vilna Shul. And we are here together. Well, we would be here together in Rab Hall. We were supposed to be, but we are fortunate that we can be together tonight for this important conversation here in this way during this challenging time. You can find out about the resources and services of the Boston Public Library by visiting bpl.org. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker and moderator for tonight's talk. Mark Hetfield has worked for the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, a large law firm as an immigration attorney, and has held multiple roles at HIAS over the years. Since being named HIAS's president and CEO in 2013, Mark has led the transformation of HIAS to helping refugees from all backgrounds. Moderator Shannon Dooling is an immigration reporter at WBUR, Boston's NPR news station. Her work can be heard nationally on NPR and Here and Now. In 2014, she co-reported on a series of stories from El Salvador and has been covering immigration ever since for WBUR and the New England News Collaborative. She also reported on family separation crisis at the U.S. Mexico border and returned to Central America, bringing back stories that connect communities in Honduras and in El Salvador to communities right here in Boston. And now, Mark, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristin. And it's great to be here. I wish I could have been there in person like we had originally planned to do back in March, but it is great to be here. And I do want to, before we start our conversation, just take you through a very quick history of HIAS. HIAS is the oldest refugee organization in the world, not just Jewish refugee organization, but the oldest refugee organization, period. We were established in 1881 on the Lower East Side of New York to help the Jews who were fleeing the pogroms of Russia and Eastern Europe at that time. And we were first in Castle Garden, and then later on Ellis Island, and it was our job to make sure that the Jewish, really refugees, though we called them immigrants at that time, who were coming in were able to get past the immigration authorities, would not be sent back home, that they would be fed kosher meals while they were on Ellis Island, that they would be able to have shelter once they finally got through the immigration authorities. And in fact, if you know New York City, the Public Theater in New York on Lafayette Street was for many years the highest headquarters and the highest shelter. And we then got them train tickets on to get them to places like Boston, places outside of New York. And then there was a highest Boston for many, many years, which was our partner agency. There was still a highest Philadelphia, a highest Chicago. There was a highest Baltimore. And then we, of course, worked with Jewish communities across the country to send refugees there. And so we did that for 40 years, and during 1881 to 1921. And during that period, the population of the American Jewish community grew from 250,000 to over 3 million. And this was due almost entirely due to immigration, because this was a time when America had its doors open, at least for Europeans, not for Asians. The Asian Exclusion Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, was passed the same time that HIAS was established. So Asians could not come in, but the door was pretty open for Jews and for others fleeing Europe. But then in 1921, the door slammed shut, and Congress passed discriminatory immigration quotas for the first time. For the first time, they required people to get visas before they could get on a ship. They were subject to very restrictive, blatantly discriminatory quotas that were designed to keep out the people who had been coming in such large numbers, including the Jews and the Italians. So HIAS had to become an international organization. We had to start operations around the world to help Jews get those visas and to help Jews get to places where they wouldn't be able, since they couldn't come to the United States any longer, since South Africa, Australia, and Canada had also shut their doors. We had to instead resettle people to countries in South America, in the Caribbean, and even in the Far East to help them find temporary shelter in places like Shanghai. During the 1930s. This restrictive law that was passed in 1921 was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to last for 1 year, but it ended up lasting until 1965, for 44 years. So throughout the 1930s and the rise to power of Hitler and the voyage of the St. Louis and the Shoah, it was very hard for refugees to flee Europe and get to the United States and get to safety here. Things changed dramatically in 1948 with two developments. One was the establishment of the State of Israel. So finally, Jews had a place to which they could go. And secondly was the recognition by the international community in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that there is a right to flee, that there is a human right to flee and seek and enjoy asylum. And that had not been a recognized right in the 1930s and in the 1940s, when so many Jews were trapped inside of a genocide in Europe and could not escape. But throughout the decades that followed, HIAS continued to help predominantly Jews migrate, the Jews who were displaced from the Middle East and the conflicts that arose between Arabs and Israel. The Jews from the displaced persons camps of Europe in the early 1950s. In 1956, we helped many of the Jewish refugees who fled the Hungarian Revolution and the crackdown, the Soviet crackdown there. And then 1959, many Jews who fled Cuba. And then once again, in the 1970s and 80s, HIAS returned to helping Russian-speaking Jews who were leaving the Soviet Union. And this was our role in the Soviet Jewry movement and how I got started at HIAS. But then at the turn of the century, things changed. At the turn of the century, there were no longer Jews who were trapped behind an iron curtain, who were in captivity. And so HIAS was able to change our work from focusing on rescuing people because they were Jewish to rescuing people because we are Jewish. And so we changed our work, opened up humanitarian programs as a Jewish organization to help refugees all over the world, regardless of faith or ethnicity, starting with Kenya in Africa, but then going on to open programs in over 15 countries across the globe. And one interesting thing to point out is when we were helping Jews from 1948 until the present, the conversation was always about resettlement. It was always, where do you want to go? HIAS will help you get there. And we worked with Israeli agencies to help Jewish refugees go to either the United States or Israel or Canada or New Zealand or Australia. That's not a conversation that we can have with most refugees. Most refugees don't have a place like Israel that they can go to. They're stuck to in the first place that will take them. So HIAS is now operating in countries of first asylum, countries like Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico, places where refugees can get to, and we help them there stay safely and make sure they don't get returned to the country that they fled from. So that has really become our work. And I do want to show a short video which goes through the entire history of HIAS in about 2 minutes. And I will say that when my staff first approached me about this video, it is an animated video. I didn't like the idea. I said, why would we show a cartoon? Our work is so serious. But you know, the fact of the matter is that what we are dealing with at HIAS, people who have fled for their lives, who have undergone severe torture and trauma, frankly, you don't want to show real images when you're talking about those things. An animated video tells the story much better. So with that, I'll show the video and then I'll turn it over to Shannon.
There are places where being who you are is a punishable offense. There are places where you might be sentenced to death because you chose to live. These places have many names, but the ones who flee have one: refugee. And it is in the name of the refugee that HIAS has dedicated itself for the last 130 years. Created in the name of the Jewish people, for the Jews who fled Tsarist Russia and Soviet Russia, the Jews who fled the death camps of Europe, the Jews exiled from places as varied as Algeria and Cuba and Iran. 4.5 million rescued and resettled so far. When they said, "Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," we were the ones at the docks helping them breathe free. And we are still at the docks and the deserts and the cities and camps and lands where people no longer have a home in their homeland. Only now it's a farmer from Darfur, a shop owner from Syria, a family from Ukraine, a child from Colombia, a Christian from Iran, a gay man from Uganda. The 70 million souls who still wander the earth in search of sanctuary. Why? Maybe it's because being Jewish means you don't have to be reminded never to forget. Maybe it's because we are called in our most sacred texts to love the stranger. Or maybe it's because as long as there are still places it is a crime to be who you are, there is still a mandate for us to be who we are. HIAS, for the refugee.
Thank you. Shannon?
Thank you, Mark, for sharing that. What a compelling, powerful video. And thank you for the invitation to be a part of this conversation this evening. My name is Shannon Dooling. I'm an immigration reporter for WBUR. I've been covering the beat for about 6 years now. And that means that I started right at the tail end of the Obama administration. And so my first foray into immigration reporting was as a producer for our esteemed Morning Edition host, Bob Oakes. Bob was interviewing a young woman who is an attorney, an immigration attorney here in Massachusetts, and she was volunteering down at the border in a family detention facility where mothers and young children were being detained while they waited out their asylum application process. We'll get into more detail about how that process has changed in the current administration. But, you know, I decided to I just had an instinct. I decided to keep in touch with this immigration attorney. And after producing the segment and pre-interviewing her and editing the tape and having the segment air, I got in touch with her and I said, Kira, are you planning on keeping in touch with any of the clients that you met there while you were doing this pro bono work? Were there any families who were trying to reunite with relatives here in Massachusetts? And she said, you know what? Yeah, there's this one woman who's trying to come to Lynn. She has a really incredible story. And I thought, well, we need to tell her story. And we did. And WBUR, is in a very envious position right now to have some of the resources that we're able to send reporters like myself and some of my colleagues to where the stories are being where people are living the stories that we're seeing in the news, right? And so in 2014, I was able to go to El Salvador and sort of mirror her experience and her journey and meet the family that she left behind and kind of try to understand more about what it was that she was fleeing and why she was compelled to leave her life and leave her young daughter in El Salvador to make the journey to the border. And that is how I got into immigration reporting. And ever since then, I have been doing the best I can in the last year or two, especially 3 or 4 years, I guess, to sort of consume, distill, and clarify all of the news that's coming at us so quickly. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think it's at a pivotal time when we do, as a nation, have immigration's on the ballot. That's a pretty clear choice, I'd say. And I don't know many people that would disagree. And so, I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to kind of dive into some of these questions that we're all asking of ourselves and of the current administration in terms of immigration policy. And I can't think of a better guest to have than Mark. So I would love to just kind of dive right into this conversation, Mark, if that sounds good to you. And as we mentioned at the top, if at any point anyone in the audience, welcome, thank you for being here. If you have questions, just pop into that little Q&A box in the bottom of your screen, type them in, and when it comes to the audience Q&A portion, I'll be sure to incorporate as many of those questions as I can. So Mark, if you're ready and you want to unmute yourself, we can just kind of get started. I think it's a really good idea to just sort of, let's define some things for people before we kind of get going into the depths of this conversation, because immigration policy, man, it is complicated. It is, unclear and murky, and there's a lot of terms and a lot of acronyms. So we're just going to kind of clarify the basics for folks. We hear a lot about illegal and legal. An illegal immigrant and a legal immigrant, or someone who came here legally. It's a bit of a misnomer because there's really it's not like you can raise your hand and say, I want to wait in line to come to the United States legally. There's no line really to sign up for, to wait in, right? So kind of, what's your experience with kind of helping people understand the difference between somebody who enters the country through a legal immigration manner and somebody who does it illegally?
And of course, yeah. So, and I try not to use the term illegal, like many of us.
Yeah.
We say undocumented, people who are undocumented. And what's really interesting is that the majority of immigrants who are undocumented actually entered the country legally, right? Over 60% of the people who are so-called illegal, the undocumented, came here on a valid visa or came here and went through, were inspected, and for whatever reason, they never went home, even though they had a time-limited permission to be here. And that's over 60% of the undocumented aren't people who snuck over the southern border. They're people who came here legally. And then over about 38% of people are undocumented, meaning they are people who came over the border without being inspected by an immigration officer. And that's, of course, what we normally think of, but that's a minority of the people in this country who are undocumented. And right now there's about 12 million. It depends who you ask, but between 10.5 million and 12 million in those two categories, which we call collectively undocumented.
Right. And so let's drill down a little bit into asylum versus refugee. There is a distinct, I think it's easy to conflate the two, but there is a distinct difference. There's a distinct difference in the way that the criteria, if you will, that is met when somebody's applying to enter the country as an asylee or as a refugee.
Right. And so this is a unique American distinction. Other countries would define it differently, but in the American sense of the word, when somebody comes to the border or is inside the country and has a fear of going home because of their race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion, they can apply for protection. They can apply for asylum. And we have to give them asylum. Under our international obligations and under the Geneva Convention of 1951 on refugees, we cannot send them back. But a refugee in the U.S. sense of the word is somebody who is not in the United States, not at our border, but is somebody in a refugee camp or in a country of first asylum living under precarious circumstances. And the United States proactively goes there, interviews people to see if they have a fear of going home. And then if they pass the interview, they bring them here as refugees. Now, an asylum, somebody who gets asylum, as I said, that's a right. Like, you have the right to asylum, but the refugee program of people who are overseas, it's entirely discretionary. It's basically asylum by invitation only. It's something the United States does to show countries of first asylum that they want to share responsibility for the people that those countries have taken in. Because asylum seekers, of course, they flee to the first country that they can get to. And those countries, by accident of geography, have very large populations of asylum seekers. Countries like, Jordan, which has over 700,000 refugees in a very small country.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned in your opening remarks, the refugee resettlement program is not that old to the U.S. I mean, it's fairly, the laws that establish it are fairly new in the grand scheme of our nation's history. And we just saw, we were talking earlier before the event started, we just saw sort of confirmation this evening of what we were expecting, that the Trump administration has announced it's formally setting the refugee cap, which is set every fiscal year by the president, supposed to be in consultation with Congress, the refugee cap to 15,000 people. Now, that's a cap, not the basement, right? So we've resettled far fewer than the, I think, 19,000 cap of refugees this year that for the previous fiscal year. So there's no guarantee that 15,000 people would be resettled. What does that tell us about the state of our refugee resettlement program in the U.S., the lowest of since the inception of the program?
Yeah, it doesn't tell you anything good. I mean, right now we're in a global refugee crisis, as you know, Shannon. Like, there are more refugees today and more forcibly displaced persons today in the world than there has been at any time in human history. I mean, even more than after the Second World War. And the United States, is expected to show leadership when it comes to, again, sharing responsibility with those countries that host the vast majority of these refugees and trying to find a solution for these refugee crises. And when the refugee program was started, as you said, it wasn't that long ago. It was only in 1980 under the Carter administration. The United States resettled 207,112 refugees in a single year. I mean, that was a demonstration in responsibility sharing. That really was contributing to addressing the refugee crises at that time, which was primarily a crisis of refugees fleeing from Southeast Asia, as well as the large number of Soviet Jews who were temporarily allowed to leave. But that was leadership. This year, with an even greater refugee crisis, especially with Syria and Venezuela and many, many other countries, because it really is a global crisis, as you mentioned, the cap this morning was 15,000. And last year it was 18,000, and only 9,000 were actually, about 10,000 were actually allowed in. So it's a total failure in American leadership.
Yeah. And I'm going to shift a little bit to asylum and the asylum process, which you mentioned. By international and our own law, we are obliged as a nation legally to afford someone who says they are afraid of returning to their home the opportunity to pursue asylum. I'm just going to ask you, I mean, 2 years ago, I was down at the border and I saw the Trump administration's metering process, which is essentially get in line. It's a fabricated crisis. They're making a wait list. They're creating a line in which they're asking people to wait for their turn to go into the U.S. to try to apply. Children, families, they show up every morning waiting to see if it's their number that's called that day. And if they're not there when their number's called, they go to the end of the list. And in the meantime, they're sleeping in tents. Is that the way our asylum system is supposed to be working? And how is it that this administration can just flout international law?
Yeah, and it's not. It never worked that way before, and actually that it's gotten worse. Like since you went there,
Yeah.
that was when the system was working at a higher level. And like the lists you talk about, they're not even maintained by the U.S. government. They're maintained informally by other asylum seekers who are just trying to create some order.
The piece of paper that these people had with their number on it was this big. It was smaller than the number you'd get at a deli. And they were expected to keep that number with them and show up and say, yes, that's my number.
Yep.
It was
and
incredible.
As I said, those and highest now works. We work along the border on both sides. We work both in Mexico as a partner of the UN Refugee Agency, and also we work on both in Texas and in Southern California with asylum seekers there. And it's actually gotten worse. So after that happened, after that system was launched by this administration with metering, they then launched the Migrant Protection Protocols, which is the most Orwellian name you could possibly come up with for this program. We call it Remain in Mexico, because what this is it's asylum seekers who come up through Mexico to the southern border. Traditionally, the United States would allow them in, actually detain them, put them in detention pending a credible fear hearing, but then they could seek asylum in the United States, although again, they would spend their first few days or weeks or even months in detention. This was changed by the Trump administration with MPP, or Remain in Mexico, and they just simply pushed them back and gave them a court date to come back to the United States. But to call this the Migrant Protection Protocols, when they have absolutely, no access to an attorney, no place to sleep, no way to feed themselves or support themselves while they're waiting in Mexico in very dangerous circumstances. There's nothing protection oriented about the Migrant Protection Protocols at all. And then after that, the Trump administration decided to create further barriers by entering into so-called safe third country agreements with countries like Guatemala. So if you were from El Salvador or Honduras and you passed through Guatemala to get to Mexico, the United States will say, well, did you apply for asylum in Guatemala? Now, Guatemala doesn't even have a functioning asylum system. But if the answer was no, which it always is, then they could also send you back to Guatemala, and you would have to pursue your asylum claim there before you could come to the United States. So that was going on. That fortunately has been suspended for the time being, but that was another possibility. And so we at HIAS, we talk about duck, duck, goose. Like when somebody is trying to enter the United States by presenting themselves, not sneaking over the border, but by presenting themselves.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
They didn't know if they were going to be, if they were lucky, they would be put in an American jail, an American detention center, and be allowed to pursue their asylum claim. That's if they were lucky. Otherwise, they would be sent back to Mexico and forced to wait for their court date in Mexico to come back to the United States. And oftentimes these court dates are rescheduled, or sometimes they would even push people back into Arizona and say you have to come over through Texas to your court date. And or you would be sent back to a country you've never lived in, like Guatemala, to pursue asylum there. So you didn't know which what would happen to you. But since COVID, they introduced yet a new thing, which is so-called Title 42, and it's an old public health law which predates our asylum laws in this country, which allows them to sit, which the Trump administration has been using to just push people back with no screening whatsoever. Like normally, when you push somebody back, you have to at least screen them to see if they have a fear of being sent back. But that's basic screening isn't even being done anymore. They're just being pushed back, and under the guise of public health.
Mark, I gotta say, I'm jealous of the sunny background that you have coming through right now as it's dark and dreary here in Boston. So I want to switch gears a little bit. We've obviously election year, everything is political right now. Immigration is no exception. In the most recent debate, it was the first presidential debate that I remember seeing where immigration came up. And it was a pretty stark opportunity for President Trump to challenge Vice President Biden on President Obama and Biden's immigration record, which, as we all can recall, President Obama was referred to as the deporter in chief by many immigration advocates and attorneys. We hear people criticizing and lamenting the changes that we've talked about to the systems under the Trump administration. Obviously, in my view and my understanding, there's a fundamental difference in, at least when you look at the second term of the Obama administration, which is when they established this, felons, not families, right? That's when Joe Biden said in the debate the other night, we made mistakes. It took us a while to figure it out. I believe this is what he was referring to. In the second term, they transitioned their enforcement priorities to a program they called Felons, Not Families. Okay, we're not going to worry about deporting, the mother who's been here for 25 years with 2 kids. Now instead, or the person who just crossed the border. Now instead, we're gonna focus on people who are violent criminals, who have felonies, who are in the country, and we're going to focus on deporting those folks. The Trump administration comes in. And all of a sudden there's no priority, which means everyone is a priority. In your estimation, what are the sort of the biggest differences, and how is it that we can hear criticisms of both administrations when it comes to this topic?
Yeah, it's hard to complain about the Obama administration now in certain terms of refugee policy, but
yeah,
it was. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the statistics in the Obama administration, it was astonishing. I mean, Obama averaged 383,000 removals every year, 383,000 deportations every year. Yeah. And Trump has only averaged 275,000. So that is astonishing. And like you said, in Obama's second term, he did reverse course and he prioritized just criminal removals and but in the first term, criminal removals was very broadly defined, and the reason the numbers were so high was because the Justice Department during the Bush administration, and it actually escalated during the Obama administration, had all these relationships with police, so-called secure communities, and so people who were pulled over for any kind of a traffic stop, even if they didn't commit a crime, would be put in removal proceedings, basically by local police. Which
our Massachusetts governor at the time, Deval Patrick, pushed up against that until Obama kind of persuaded him that, hey, this is how it's going to work. It's not that bad. Massachusetts was a part of that.
Yeah, and so I'm in California right now. So was California. California doesn't do that anymore. So the reason why Trump's numbers are lower are because states and localities decided they didn't want any part of this, right? They backed out. And that's why Trump and Attorney General Sessions, when he was the Attorney General, were always railing against these so-called sanctuary communities. And they meant that in a very broad sense, and that these were communities that just refused to do the job of ICE officers for them. So those numbers have changed, and also, frankly, when it came to refugees, the Obama administration was nothing special. They kept the numbers at the same level as the Bush administration for his first 6 years in office. And when everybody woke up, in the meantime, the global refugee crisis started in 2011. It was 2015 when the world and the country and President Obama woke up that there's a global refugee crisis and not enough was being done, and it was only a matter of time before that crisis was not going to be contained anymore and was going to spread to the rest of the world. And sure enough, that's why you saw this huge influx of asylum seekers into Europe in 2015. So that's when Obama woke up and demonstrated some real leadership, but it was only in the last 2 years or less of his administration, the year and a half of his administration. He raised the refugee ceiling from 70,000, where it had been forever, to 85,000 and then to 110,000 for 2017. He convened the first ever summit on refugees in New York at the margins of the General Assembly. But again, this was in the last months of his administration. So he was really stepping up and showing leadership, but it was very late in the game. And that was thrown into reverse by the Trump administration, which has done the total opposite and led the rest of the world to the bottom. So refugees are just not finding solutions anymore. And that's why the number of displaced persons increased from a little over 70 million a year ago to almost 80 million when the UN released the statistics this June. It's just spinning out of control because no one is demonstrating any leadership here.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens at the polls when we do have a definitive victor. Also in the news, it's been a very busy news cycle. Also in the news, we've seen, of course, the Senate just recently voted to confirm Amy Coney Barrett as the newest member of the Supreme Court, the newest Supreme Court justice. The first thing that comes to mind for me in terms of immigration with the Supreme Court is, of course, DACA. But I wonder where you see the Supreme Court potentially weighing in on immigration policy in the near future.
Yeah, that's a good question. And a lot is going to hinge on this election, frankly, because obviously the Supreme Court has a very conservative supermajority as of today, and I'm sure there are a number of cases being litigated that relate to refugees and asylum and immigration, and obviously they will be mooted if Vice President Biden is elected. They will likely be mooted and won't be litigated in the court. But if President Trump is reelected, there's no question that those cases will be litigated, and there are cases again on refugees, on asylum, on the migrant protection protocols that I just spoke about, on DACA, and I wouldn't bet on any of them turning out favorably, given the current constitution of the court. I'm quite concerned about it. So a lot is from the perspective of advocates for immigrants and refugees, a lot is hinging on this election, because I can't imagine much good will come out of that court. I mean, Highest itself right now, we're suing Donald Trump in a case where we just had oral argument yesterday in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond, and what we're suing him on, along with the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service and Church World Service, is this executive order he issued earlier this year, where it allowed states and localities to basically drop out of the refugee program, to bar refugees from being resettled in their states, and which we find to be a violation of the Refugee Act of 1980. Unfortunately, the district court judge found the same way and issued an injunction against that from being implemented. And yesterday, the government appealed it. We had oral argument, and so we're waiting to hear what the ruling is in that case. But if we win that in the circuit court, there's no question it will be appealed to the Supreme Court. So again, I'm hoping this gets.
Yeah. Well, look, we have about 15 minutes left. I want to encourage people to drop your questions in the Q&A box, and I'm going to start with a few of the questions from our audience. Miriam Grodberg, I hope I'm doing justice to the names here, asks, how does a person prove they are in danger and need asylum? It's a great question, Miriam. Mark, do you want to discuss that a little bit? And yeah,
it is a good question, and it's largely through testimony. An asylum seeker and refugee, because they often leave without documents, literally flee with nothing but the clothes on their back, or have to create false documents in order to leave. They have to prove it through testimony. And I used to be an immigration officer. I was a refugee officer for a time in the government. We're very well trained to question people in these lengthy interviews to determine whether or not they have a well-founded fear of persecution based on who they are or what they believe. If they have documents, that's great. That helps their case. But otherwise, it's really based primarily on your own testimony.
When is it, Mark, that country conditions are taken into account? Is that more when you're in front of an immigration judge, if you've gotten through the point of getting, your interview with USCIS, or demonstrable strife in a country that's going through civil war or what have you?
Yeah, country conditions are critical, absolutely critical. And DHS has a entire section that's dedicated to researching country conditions for asylum officers, and trains asylum officers on country of origin information called COI. And so they have to familiarize themselves with that. And so an asylum interview, your initial interview, usually when you are applying for asylum, is it's non-adversarial. So it's the asylum officer interviewing the asylum seeker. And so it's important for the asylum officer to be able to question, to elicit information from the asylum seeker to make sure that information is consistent with the country conditions research that the asylum officer has done. But when you go to immigration court, it's an adversarial system. So in the immigration court system, which you have an ICE attorney who is arguing against you getting asylum in every single case. So the judge has to be aware of country condition information, but also he relies on the adversarial process to get information about the country of origin and about the applicant's claim.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Judy asks, in the event that we get a new administration and there's a possibility of opening up the refugee program again to more people, am I correct that it will take some time to reestablish the infrastructure because many refugee agencies have greatly reduced their staff, or even worse, were forced to close? Is there going to be a trickle effect of,
I'm optimistic. I mean, it is true that about a third of refugee resettlement sites have been closed over the course of this administration. But we still have resettlement sites in all 50 states. And interestingly, the interest in refugee resettlement is stronger than ever. Like again, in 2015, when that photograph of Ilan Kurdi, the little Syrian refugee boy's body, was washed up on the shore of Turkey, that photograph, I think, inspired so many people into action and so many volunteers that it really kind of reinvigorated the refugee program and the interest. So we unfortunately, during the Trump administration, have had far more volunteers than we know what to do with because of this situation. So I really think that this public-private partnership can come back very, very quickly if things change around in another few months. But if we have to endure another 4 years of this kind of attack and damage, I'm not so sure it'll be so easy to come back.
Yeah. There has been just a systematic gutting of a lot of processes and infrastructures. It's a good point. A lot of these questions I'm seeing are similar, which is a call to action. And I'm going to hold that for the end because I want that to be a hopeful note that we can go out on. But another question here is, Can you provide your thoughts? This is from an anonymous attendee. Can you please provide your thoughts on what could happen to TPS, that's temporary protected status, under a Trump administration or a Biden administration? I'm not sure I'm sure you're familiar with TPS, Mark, so you can take a stab at that. My personal opinion is, or my educated opinion, I guess, would be that, Trump has made it clear where the temporary protected status falls on his list of, these are folks who in many ways are, it's a very, I don't like using this term, but it's a term that his administration has used. It's low-hanging fruit, right? They know where they are. They know their addresses. These are people who check in regularly with the Trump administration. It's sort of easy, if you will, to try to remove them if they wanted to do that. But they're also people who've lived in the community for 20 years in some instances. Biden has said he would, at least on his immigration platform, has said he would pursue a path to citizenship for TPS residents. What else do you think makes a differentiation between those two administrations, or does that kind of say it all?
Well, one wants a path to citizenship for these people who have been here. I mean, many of them have been here for well over a decade. Some of them have been here for decades, literally, for 20 years since Hurricane Mitch and whatnot.
Yeah.
So one wants a path to citizenship. One wants to remove them. And so that's the divergent thing. And that's the thing, temporary protected status, it is supposed to be temporary.
Right.
So
right.
They do need a permanent fix. And this is why, like, the thing that's burdening TPS is the same thing that's burdening the asylum system, which is that there has been no pathway for people to legalize their status who have been living here and paying taxes and and obeying our laws. There's just been no way for them to legalize their status. And this was a priority of the George W. Bush administration. It was a so-called priority of the Obama administration. It was not a priority of the Trump administration, but it just has to happen. We have a backlog in the immigration courts of over 1 million cases. You can't overcome a backlog like that ever. There's a backlog in the asylum core of almost 400,000 cases right now. Again, you can't overcome a backlog like that. And it's only but if you had a legalization program, it would resolve those issues. It would resolve the TPS issues, and then you would have millions of people coming out of the shadows who were living here anyway, and actually being able to work legally and being able to actually contribute rather than spend all their time hiding.
Yeah. So one wants to end TPS, one wants to pursue a pathway to citizenship. Congress needs to act to figure out something to remedy the fact that temporary protected status was conceived as a temporary status. Congress's inaction is not to be dismissed here. This is a great question. What is true and what is false about the statement that Obama built and kept children in cages before Trump? Of course, this is referencing the debate the other night where Vice President Biden really was hitting hard against President Trump about the family separation crisis. President Trump then, in his sort of characteristic way, was just peppering Biden with Obama built the cages. You built the cages, Joe. Mark, what kind of clarity can you offer us in terms of, I mentioned I was in Artesia, New Mexico in 2014 when families were being detained, oftentimes against court rulings. They were being detained for more than a month. But what's your sort of summary of that?
Yeah, I mean, there was, because of the violence in the Northern Triangle in Central America, which of course surged during the Obama years, there was a surge in arrivals of unaccompanied children over the border who were fleeing. Many of them have some relatives in the United States, and they were fleeing the violence in Central America to get to some relatives in the United States who could take care of them and protect them and make them safe. And Obama, did not deal with it in a great way, especially at first. And it is true that, yes, they had so many coming in, they had to hold them someplace temporarily while they were processed by the Border Patrol before giving them to the Office of Refugee Resettlement so they could be put in proper homes. So for short term, and I mean very short term, yes, they were kept in these awful cages, which is unacceptable and inexcusable. But what the Obama administration didn't do is it didn't separate kids from their parents. I mean, that is something that this administration did as a deterrent, as a, and they did it and they decided to prosecute everybody who was entering to seek asylum, which is illegal, right? It's a violation of international law. It is not a crime to enter a country for the purpose of seeking asylum. That has to be protected. So yes, the Obama administration is not beyond reproach here, but what the Obama administration did is you can't compare it to the atrocities, and they were atrocities committed by the Trump administration when it comes to the treatment of children and families at the border.
Thank you. Thank you for that. This is a great question. Amy Perlmutter asks, are climate refugees on HIAS's radar screen?
Oh man, I get asked that question so often, and it's such a good question. The problem is that the Refugee Convention, as I mentioned, it was written in 1951, and it was written specifically about refugees in Europe, right? Even that wasn't just the context. That it actually said this is a temporary convention for refugees in Europe. And then in 1967, the UN decided, okay, well, we'll just expand it to the whole world. But it was written for people who were fleeing persecution, from Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in the 1940s and 50s, and now you have it doesn't really fit. We apply it, but it doesn't fit asylum seekers from Central America as neatly, where you're fleeing gang violence, who are de facto states, and it certainly doesn't fit climate refugees, right? It didn't anticipate that there would be such a thing. So
right.
Yeah, so to be honest, we need to kind of reconsider this framework. But I'll be honest with you, we advocates are afraid to reopen it because the direction things have been going in, instead of broadening it and protecting more people, it will be tightened, and less people may be protected in this current environment. So we have to tread that area very, very carefully. But yeah, we're talking about climate refugees every day, and there needs to be something done, because the bottom line is, if you are fleeing for your life, whatever causes you to flee, I mean, that should be the bottom line, that you are fleeing for your life and that you need protection. And it's up to the international community, not just the United States, but the international community, to either help people be safe where they are, or to save their lives by bringing them to some other place of safety. And if the whole world does it, it can be done.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Mark, is that something that needs to be brought up at the UN level then? The United Nations Human. Yeah.
Yes, and it is. I mean, it is something. The Secretary General, as you know, used to be the head of used to be the High Commissioner for Refugees in his previous job. That's what Antonio Guterres did. And when he was High Commissioner for Refugees, he was very focused on root causes, and he was focused on climate migration and trying to deal with that. And he continues to be focused that as Secretary General. But here in the United States, the first thing we have to do is admit that there's climate change, right? So, so before we can address climate migration, we have to admit that there's climate change, and then we can build from there. But we're not even at the stage now where we can admit that there's climate change. So we have a long way to go in this country before we can be a leader in terms of addressing the imminent climate migration crisis.
Right. Okay, we have time for a few more questions here, and these are all great. I'm going to try to get to as many of them as we can. This is interesting. Aside from the moral argument for the U.S. accepting refugees, I would also say the legal argument. What points would you make to skeptical relatives and friends for, why we should be welcoming and our obligation to refugees?
Sure. Yeah, and there are practical arguments, and there's a lot of them. And I'll start with the most practical, and then address the moral arguments, which are also important. But just look at Europe in 2015, right? I mean, when I've been in this field for a long time, for 31 years now, And looking at the development of the Syrian migration crisis was shocking, because in 2011, you started to have hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Syria. And then it ultimately became millions, right, of refugees and displaced persons in Syria. And they were all going to Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, And so these countries had to host hundreds of thousands, or in Turkey's case, it's millions of people of refugees from a neighboring country. Countries that are much smaller than we are had to take in numbers that we have never even had to imagine taking in of refugees. And it was only a matter of time before they would become saturated. They would go beyond their saturation points. And sure enough, that happened. And when refugees could no longer be safe or be allowed into those countries, they decided, well, we got to move again. So they risked their lives, crossed the Mediterranean. Thousands and thousands of them drowned trying to get to Europe to find safe haven there. If you do not address the refugee crisis, it will come to you. And it's just a matter of time before it comes to your country. So you need to address it now. You need to allow for safe and orderly ways to migrate. Obviously, your first priority is to have people be safe where they are. But even then, you're going to reach a breaking point like we did in Southeast Asia. So the U.S. showed leadership and resettled hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees here, and they're doing great right now. We took them in, they were well integrated, and they're doing very well, and they're contributing to our society. But that's the thing, like you cannot prevent refugee flows from reaching you, because if people are fleeing for their lives, they're going to flee for their lives, and they're going to be highly motivated to get to safety and get to the best place they can get to keep their families safe, so they don't have to endure that again. So we have to address it, and that's what's happening in Central America too. In our case, our Central America is like the Syria is to Europe. We have to address these things. And then the other thing I would say, though, in terms of the moral argument, which is really important, the arguments that are being used today to keep refugees out are the exact same arguments that were used to keep Jews out in the 1920s and 1930s. The exact same. They were and I love people say, no, we were different. We weren't going to come here and commit acts of terror. Well, first of all, in the over 3 million refugees that have been admitted since 1980 in the refugee program, not a single one has committed a lethal act of terror. Not a single one. That's not to say it won't ever happen, but that's obviously not a problem. People who are trying to solve refugees as a security issue are solving a problem that does not exist in this country. And the arguments to keep Jews out was that Jews can't assimilate, Jews are terrorists, they're radicals, they're communists, they're socialists, or even they have family in Nazi-occupied Europe, and so they're vulnerable to to extortion. So these arguments that were used to keep Jewish refugees out in the 30s. So it's no more valid today than it was then. Refugees are by definition people who are fleeing persecution, not people who are bringing terror to this country. They're people who are fleeing terror.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to address 2 quick questions, and then I want to end, Mark, with your suggestions for how people can sort of a call to action and what people can do to contribute to the work that HIAS is doing and to just sort of address some of the things that we've talked about. Really quickly, Karina Wilkinson asks about immigration detention here in New York and in Newark. Offices are looking to contract for new facilities that would hold up to 900 people each. Do we know if there's any attempt to do the same in Mass? Karina, I don't believe that there is. And the reason I say that is because overall nationwide detention, the numbers of immigrants in detention is down. And that's because the Trump administration is trying really rapidly to deport as many people as they can. And it's also a reflection of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some detainees have been released under, house arrest. They're on an ankle bracelet. They're under the sort of orders to appear to ICE and present themselves to ICE on a regular basis. I haven't heard about facilities, which are only the only facilities in Massachusetts that hold ICE federal immigrant detainees are county jails and the Department of Corrections at the state level. We don't have any private prisons here. And then the other thing I want to ask real quickly is, please talk about Venezuelan refugee crisis and the possibility for Venezuelans to receive TPS under Trump. I don't see that as a realistic possibility for the reasons that we've talked about, just in terms of the way that the Trump administration is approaching TPS. But, I could be wrong. Mark, what are your quick thoughts on that?
No, I mean, we are neck deep in the Venezuelan refugee crisis. We have operations, including in Venezuela, throughout South America, dealing primarily with Venezuelan refugees. There's nearly 4 million of them. And if there ever was a population that needs TPS, it's Venezuelans in the United States right now. But you're right, the Trump administration is just, even though they would get some political gain, frankly, from naming Venezuela as a TPS country, by kind of sticking it to the de facto government there, they won't do it because of their anti-immigration stance. Even though Venezuelans that are here are going to stay here, they can't go home right now.
We have so many great questions, but many of them overlapped with this one sentiment. So I want to end on this note, Mark. What can people do if they feel compelled to act, if they feel compelled to take action of some sort after listening to the conversation tonight? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have to tread a little bit carefully here, but we do have an election coming up in a week, and we do have some nonpartisan materials on the highest website called Vote for Welcome. So please check that out immediately and act on that over the course of the next week. But we like to say there are lots of opportunities to educate, advocate, donate, and volunteer. And again, those opportunities are all on the highest website, but there are many, many things that you can do. You don't have to be a lawyer, although lawyers are desperately in need because as you know, as I explained, the way that the immigration court system works is you have to argue your case against an ICE attorney, and you don't have a chance if you, right? You as an asylum seeker who doesn't speak English doesn't have a chance arguing your case against the ICE who's there in the courtroom with you. So we need attorney volunteers, but we need volunteers who are willing to serve in all sorts of ways to make people feel welcome, to help them learn English, and to help them succeed in this country. So again, educate, donate, volunteer, and are the ways to go.
Mark, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I think we have a closing sentiment from Lynn.
Thank you so much, Mark and Shannon. This has been enlightening and really educational. So we appreciate that you are joining us a full 6 months after our original date. And I hope that we have better things to talk about after this election, and perhaps we can continue the conversation in the next year. For those of you who are still with us, we encourage you to please share. We have recorded this. We will have the recording up on the Vilna's YouTube page tomorrow, and it is live on Facebook right now. So you can go to the Vilna Facebook page and share that way if you would like to do so instantly. The more people we can get to see this conversation and this discussion, the more we can continue to educate people on this topic. And that is really the purpose of the Vilna, is to help provide education and build community through a Jewish lens and a Jewish perspective. A quick few plugs for upcoming events. Tomorrow night, we have a fabulous author, Mimi LeMay, talking about her family's change from a modern Orthodox family to more accepting as her child came out as trans, and what that looked like and how her modern Orthodox community reacted to her family change. And then this Sunday, we have an incredible program. It's the U.S. premiere of a wonderful documentary called Secrets of the Synagogue, which is about the archaeological dig that has been happening in Vilnius over the past 3 years to uncover the Grand Synagogue that once stood prior to World War II. When you register, and it's a free event, you will be emailed the link to watch the film. And then this Sunday, we have the lead archaeologist from the U.S., Richard Freund, in conversation with the film director and also some of the key players who helped develop technology to help uncover and map out where the Grand Synagogue stood and what it looked like. And so that is this Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as I know not everyone is in our own time zone, Mark included. And so I want to thank everyone for joining us, and be well, stay safe. Have a good night, everyone.